Dr. Rashidah ideally wants the presentation on a laptop, and she's having problems getting Wi-Fi.
A knowledge management approach. She's now a special officer in Sarawak Ministry of Tourism, Creative and Performing Arts. She served Sarawak first as the first Chief Executive Officer of Pustaka Negeri Sarawak, where she made a huge impact on library services and local communities. And then she went on to be the permanent secretary for the Ministry of Women, Early Childhood and Community Wellbeing. She's also been the president of the Library Association Malaysia, a member of the Malaysian IPO Corporation, My IPO, and on the international platform, she serves as a member of the IFLA's Advisory Committee on Cultural Heritage. Her talk today is entitled A Three-Tiered Indigenous Knowledge, a Method for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage. Ladies and gentlemen, please can you join me in giving a warm applause to Datu Dr. Rashidah.
Really looking forward to this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valerie, for the kind introduction. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. A very good afternoon to everyone. Can you hear me? I tend to kind of talk in a very bass tone. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Institute of Border Studies to invite me. Dr. Valerie has been quite persistent in making sure that I am here today. Thank you so much for that. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to also thank your presence today. It made a lot of meaning to me because Dr. Valerie made me revisit my work, my research, after quite sometimes I've left it being on my shelf. Rereading the work brings back a flash of memories of going through the studies and going through the connectivity and also the engagement that I had with my research participants. Now, rightly, as Dr. Valerie mentioned just now, when one elder died, the whole library of knowledge dies from that person. And indigenous knowledge has become something very important now, especially with issues on climate change, issues on environmental sustainability. How did our forefathers manage to sustain it until now for us? And what are we going to do next for the future generation? All of us know that we're living in a state of diverse communities of indigenous people with lots of wisdom, not just knowledge, but wisdom that they have where they kind of survive and they live in. Now, why did I want to do this topic? Can you see that? I cannot wait for my own. Let me just move my screen first. Now, I started my career as a librarian, and when I was tasked to lead the Sarawak State Library, one of the tasks for us was to state a center of excellence on Sarawakiana. Anything and everything to do about Sarawak, its people, its knowledge, its history, its identity. Now, but for us to get information about Sarawak from our own people, by our own people, was really a challenge. When publication was still in its, I should say, in its hard print, it was quite easy for us. We can source the publications everywhere around the world of what was being written about Sarawak. But more often than not, it's by being published, being written by people outside of Sarawak. Okay. Now, but when we started the Sarawak collection, we wanted to have our own voice, our own thinking and perspective of our own people, the emic view of our own information. Now we had a challenge. So we went out to try to document. But in the initial years, we had challenges. Not many people want to open up to us. Not many people want to share information to us. What we got was basically what you and I able to see or observe on our own. So my motivation for this one is how can we really work with the knowledge holders so that we really get the information that you want for dissemination, and most importantly, to preserve and safeguard our cultural heritage. But the most important thing is, how do we ensure that when we do this collection of information, we really observe their cultural sensitivities? This is the outline of my presentation this afternoon, sorry. I'll give a very brief introduction on what we meant or what I meant by indigenous in the scope of my study, and I'll share with you these findings and share with you some of the stories. And from the recommendations, I hope that all of you will be here, or whoever is out there listening, will take kind of that as an impetus for further study or some kind of action on our part, on ourselves. How do we manage to preserve and safeguard our own knowledge here? Just a brief, what actually is indigenous knowledge about? It's becoming more fashionable now. It's more, is being referred to a lot. Now, it's always nice to know that this information is always embodied by the indigenous people, of course. It's embedded in the traditional cultural expressions. Sometimes you can see it, but more often than not, a lot are still tacit in nature, and it is a living knowledge. It moves and it is interconnected with the people, with the environment, in the way the people are living. Posey, in his journal article on the commodification of the sacred through intellectual property rights, is one of my favorite authors here. It says, the interdependent on the relationships between human, nature, the tangible, visible world, and the invisible spirit world, most often than not, handed over from generation to generation and is mostly transmitted orally. Now, this is one of the documents that I always refer to, the purposes of the 2003 UNESCO Convention. That convention helps to help as a guideline to safeguard the intangible cultural heritage. More often than not, we see something tangible, but we do not know the stories behind it, the people behind it, what's the taboos behind it or the rituals behind it. Now, this convention also is one of the guidelines for us to ensure that when we do the documentation in our effort to safeguard and preserve, the most important thing is that respect for the intangible cultural heritage of the communities, the groups, and the individuals. And also we need to raise awareness, not just at the local level, national level, most importantly at international level itself. And also this convention, you can find this convention online. if you type in the Google UNESCO Convention of Intangible Cultural Heritage, it gives you there. Yesterday, the last I read, it has a 2022. Sorry. Thank you. So can you hear me now? The latest update is the 2022 version of it. Now, to look at the tangible is easy. I mean, something that we can look and feel and see. But I'll just focus a lot. The part of the indigenous knowledge is really the intangible part of it. In the convention, this is the definition that UNESCO gave. It includes the practices, the representations, the expressions, the skills, as well as the instruments, the objects, the artifacts, the cultural spaces, even the landscape. And of course, it gives you that sense of identity and continuity in the community. Now, again, more often than not, it's intangible. And this is the knowledge, this is encoded in their verbal expressions, such as their stories, their riddles, their proverbs, their rituals, their music, their songs, their dances. And for the purpose of my work, these are the domains that I could about. The oral traditions and expressions, including their language. Much of our indigenous language at the moment, some are really being eroded at a very high pace before we can even manage to record it for preservation or for safeguarding. The performing arts, with globalization and the world of the internet at the moment, we tend to go in the mainstream, and sometimes we forgot our own performing arts identity. Our social practices, again, with religion coming in, a lot of our earlier practices of beliefs are also being eroded. Some are being sort of adjusted to meet with our local and current times. Now, these domains are the ones that we should look into and look into in our community. Watch to the right and your left, your community, where you live, for example. Where are these and what kind of knowledge do you know are available out there? From the point of the heritage institutions, okay, we identify when we want to safeguard, these are the things that we need to do. We want to identify what we need to safeguard. And of course, documentation and the research will come in, promotion and enhancement, for example. And we have to transmit and educate and give a lot of awareness of people regarding this knowledge. Now, what really attracted me to the Article 11 of the Convention which is very important, is when we identify and define the various elements of our intangible cultural heritage, we must have the participation and the consent of our communities. This is, in a way, sort of decolonizing the way we look at things when we want to safeguard, when we want to acquire, especially for those in the heritage institutions. I come from a Western paradigm of education. At the library, when we do classification and categorization of the books that we have, it's all based on Western-centric sort of classification system. And I'm sure in the museum world as well, or in the galleries, that kind of provenance are also being practiced. When we want to expand on the categories of Sarawak materials, we have to expand the subject headings of Library of Congress with permission. We have to expand on the entry names for our local people, because the Western-centric way of adding a name or the author is by surname. And in our case, we do not use surname as our entry. So my work, you can most of the time using my work under my father's name, not under my name. So I'm not being known, but my father's name is being known out there. So we have to work with the global bodies that you must recognize the way we do things. So we have initiated, Pustaka have initiated subject headings with local needs, and also expansion of the classification system to go beyond just Sarawak. So that's the role of what our heritage, our local heritage institution, to educate the world out there, the body of knowledge out there, that we also have our knowledge bodies as well. Now, the role of the cultural heritage institutions in my studies, I had 6 organizations that were part of my participants. In our field, the cultural heritage institutions are what we call the GLAM, which includes the galleries, the libraries, the archives, the museums. These are the institutions that collect, that acquire, that help to manage and such, and also disseminate this information. We have to educate the world that we have our own body of knowledge. So we have to add to how things are being done in museum. Of course, one of the ways of safeguarding is through documentation. Documentation can be in any form, be there with starting with a simple registry of assets that you have in your organization by recording, for example, doing a catalog of the books that you have, or doing a catalog of the recordings that you have of what you have done to collect the knowledge of our people. Well, those are various ways of documenting. Now, the Western-centric way of doing it, generally, okay, there is now a movement towards decolonizing methods of managing artifacts or books in museums and the GLAMs. The common practice for us was to separate the tacit, which are in the minds of the people, and mostly intangible, with the explicit. More often than not, when you go to a museum, for example, or you go to a library, okay, you will see this book by this author, but beyond that, what is it? What did the author have to go through in order to come up with a book about the traditional healing of the Melanau, for example? What did they have to go through to get the local people to share their knowledge? Now, how do we go about addressing this? This picture I took is from a gallery at Rani. I start to pose a lot of questions. What is this basket? What is it made of? What is it for? Who's the artisan? How did she weave? How did she learn how to weave? How did she make it black instead of the natural color? I had a lot of questions. So there's a lot of stories. Once, I hope after this, your takeaway is when you see something, it's just beyond the physical, tangible thing that you see. My findings through my studies, I went through, I used a narrative inquiry as my method of my research, and I used a lot of interviews. And I use NVivo to really dissect the interview. And being a qualitative researcher is not that easy. The stories are never ending, and the data is just too much to handle. From my analysis, the key theme is the knowledge holders who decide what to share. If I come in, and during the interview, I experienced this myself. When I came on my own, like it's a total closed door. Who are you? And all that. And they even, sometimes they do not even want to see me. But I have to go through the proper protocols.
And even these cultural protocols is something that we need to document. And especially in an academia like this, and then when you're doing research down on the ground with our people, please observe this protocol. And I hope there will be courses on teaching our researcher the appropriate protocol when you're doing indigenous research. The knowledge sharing method depends on the knowledge types that knowledge holder holds. Who can share? Not necessarily the knowledge holder will share. There's one of the interview, the person that shared the information or the knowledge with me was not the knowledge holder herself, but her daughter, because she's not allowed to say anything. The protocol is that she has to go through an intermediary. The knowledge holder also will be the one who decides whom she would want to share and when she will share it. There's one documentation effort that we did on the Melanau healing. We have to do it through the night. We cannot do it during the daytime because of obvious cultural reasons. Out of this research, I found out this tiered knowledge system. Now, ladies and gentlemen, bear in mind also I come from, libraries are rigid knowledge management bodies. So I kind of adopt the knowledge management theories into this and put it into our indigenous system to make it more systematic. From this, these are the characteristics of indigenous knowledge. There are 3 tiers. Tier 1 is the base knowledge. Tier 2, the ceremonial and ritual. And the uppermost here will be the sacred knowledge. And from this arrow, you can see that the knowledge distribution for tier 1 base knowledge is very high and wide. But as you go up here, the knowledge distribution is very low. Obviously, because it's quite sacred, it's not just simply being shared just like that. And the knowledge depth is the reverse. On base knowledge is very low. And if you go to the sacred knowledge, the knowledge depth is very high and a lot of requirements for people to have this. Now, what would be tier 1 knowledge? Can anybody guess? For example, if you go to a wedding, to me, that's passive knowledge. Everybody knows it's a wedding, the paraphernalia, the rituals and all that. And that is for communal sharing. That's a shared foundation. All of us assume that we all know. Yeah. And it's accessible to all, even without you asking it. But when you want to go to tier 2, you want to go to have a little bit deeper, the sharing and transfer of this knowledge, you have to work with somebody who is willing to share with you. And you have to be proactive in asking that information or that knowledge. And it requires our active participation. One of my interviews was on the making of the terinda among the Melanaus. They would not simply share it earlier on, simply because some have their own colors, for example, some have their own design. But when you go into the sacred knowledge, not necessarily, as I mentioned earlier on, the person who has that knowledge, especially in the healing knowledge, he or she might not give it to you as a knowledge holder, might be through an intermediary. Or the other way around is, even if you don't ask it, but they say they choose you to have it, that is also happening. So The sharing of knowledge here really depends on the consent, the type of knowledge, the people who are supposed to receive it. I just want to share with you my own personal story. I'm very, very attached to this indigenous knowledge because my grandmothers are local healers. Just one simple, my maternal grandmother, she does healing for those for maternity. I tell you, if I am to get that, or if she has passed that knowledge to me, I don't have to go through or talks, or she has those knowledge that will always keep them young. My grandmother never got sick until the last day of her life. She was only having fever, then she passed on. What makes her so youthful? We hardly bring her to the doctor. And I'm sure some of your elder folks are also like that. But did we ask them? I did. But my grandmother, I was just 12 years old then. She was saying, not for you, not yet. But that not yet, until even after I gave birth to my third child, is still not yet, until she passed on. So much so that a lot of her knowledge is just gone. I'm sure a lot of you relate to this. Those of you who make yeast for making tapai, who can relate to that? Do you know about that knowledge? She would refuse, because I normally help her with pounding. Last time there's no blender or machine or whatsoever. It's all through hard work and muscle. I used to help her pounding the rice and pounding all the spices that goes into the making of the yeast or the ragi, we call it. But once I reached puberty, she would not get me near her when she's doing it. For a reason only known to herself. Because if I'm going to go near her, if I'm having my menstruation, her ragi literally turn red. What is that relation? I do not know. Up till now, I don't understand. And I'm sure you've heard of stories as well when people make the tapai. If you see somebody's tapai is red, it's not clean enough. Clean in that sense. So I'm still having just base knowledge. I don't even have the ceremonial or ritual on, not even the sacred. So these characteristics of indigenous knowledge, the heritage institutions must observe this. Let's go back and revisit for those of you who have done documentation of our indigenous knowledge. Is it deep enough? Is it enough for us to keep it in our museums or to be recorded in libraries, for example? As I mentioned just now, the levels of knowledge sharing. The passive knowledge sharing is all of us know it, we see it, even we're not invited to it, we know it. The use of the pua, when do you see it? The use of all the artifacts during rituals, weddings, birth, death. We saw that. And this is a know what, we know, just what is it for? But the know-how of it needs active knowledge sharing, really hands-on, even what we call as an intern, participating in doing it. Simple, ketupat. Who knows how to weave the ketupat? Hands up. I'll put my hands down because I fail. I do not know how to weave the ketupat, and there's so many versions of the ketupat. And there's so many things. Okay, with this ketupat, you cannot fill it up to full-fledged of it. So that kind of knowledge. My mother said, "Oh, cukup lah, yeah, that's enough." Just by looking. And I have to do like, is this enough? I have to measure, still not good enough. And it doesn't come out right. You have to really do it, practice. And then, of course, with the sacred knowledge. When I did the interview, on the Pua. I find the Pua is a very fascinating, tangible, traditional cultural expressions, which has endless stories. The processes of just tier 2, for example. Tier 1 is, you know what the Pua is used for weddings, for birth, for death. But the other part of the Pua, which some of us might not know, is the sacred use of the Pua as a blanket. One of the stories I received was it was being used to cover the skulls during warfare. Again, the knowledge sharing here is the why. We need to know the why. This is a part that we really need to kind of preserve a lot. Now let's share the stories. I've sort of, this need to be expanded from all the knowledgeable people here. I did this research almost 10 years ago. See, the tier 1, the knowledge on the use of the Pua I mentioned just now, and knowledge on the network of Pua weavers. You know who are the practitioners, you know who are the weavers in the kampong, for example, or in Rumah Panjang. That part, you know, easy to know. But the knowledge on level 2, 1 and 2, knowledge on the processes of the Pua. What do they do when they do the dyeing? What are the rituals that the women have to do in the olden days to ensure that the colors of the dyes are really being absorbed by the threads, for example? What do the weavers do when they want to choose an icon to be used in the Pua? Who can use what icon when? That kind of information is really, really rich and very deep. A young, new amateur weaver cannot simply use any type of icons. And during the weaving, the person who is weaving cannot tell the stories about the icon she's using. And during the weaving, when she's done for the day, she has to cover her weaving loom. Why? I always ask why. Now, are we aware of this? A lot of us, we know that the Pua is there, is an Iban traditional cultural expression, but the stories behind it, we do not do enough about it. The other thing is the meaning of icons in the Pua, especially amongst the Ibans, from the information that I gathered and from the data that I gathered during the interview, is very, very meaningful to them. Some are very sensitive. So I try to juxtapose the level 1 and 2, and level 1, 2, and 3, and level 3. There's one story that kind of touched my heart, is when the Pua weaver know that she's going to go, she would do what I call a swan song piece before she died. Now, in my layman's eye, I would not be able to say which is a masterpiece, which is a swan song piece of that weaver. It needs another person to educate me. So, there's a lot of opportunity for us to research and to do, and this is just about that Pua amongst the Iban. There's a lot more of traditional cultural expressions out there. The uses of the Pua, the common uses of it, the ceremonials, when do we do it? When do we use what Pua? There are different versions of it. The sacred uses of it, for example. The making of the Pua, I mentioned just now, the pre-weaving, the mirroring that you have to do, the nga session that you have to do, the choosing of the icons, for example, and also the status of the weaver, the rituals of icon sharing. I like this. This is something to do about intellectual property, the way I see it. When I give you my icon to use, you have to give me something in return, which they call it as pengeras. In the modern day, is acknowledging your copyright. The rituals of the weaving, that also. There are certain rituals, you don't simply, macam kita jahit baju, you just go on the sewing machine and just sew it. But the hua, you have to really respect the weaver, the rituals, and the whole process of coming up with one. But at the same time, in the market, we have machine woven hua already. So what would be lost? This kind of knowledge, that sacred knowledge behind it. Now, how do we bring this to the cultural institutions? How do the cultural institutions manage these levels of tacit indigenous knowledge embedded in the explicit knowledge container? In this case, the hua is the knowledge container. There's so much of it embedded in there. I leave it as a question for us to discuss. The other thing that I would like to kind of highlight over here, the indigenous people of Australia, they have what they call the keeping places when they give or they share their knowledge to heritage institutions. And if you go to the websites of Australian heritage institutions, normally they'll give certain kind of salute or opening to respect the owners of the land. How are we here? What are we doing? That sacred knowledge that we have, although a lot is being lost because of conversion to religions and all that. But how can this be shared? Spiritual links. I've heard stories, I'm not sure how true it is. This is not part of my study. I've heard stories of how they want to move the burial poles, and it can't be moved until they have certain kind of rituals to it. I heard about it, and I do not know how to confirm and confer with people. The other thing is the heritage institutions have to identify the knowledge holders, which are fast going. The knowledge holders of the true blue, in-depth cultural knowledge that we have. Do we have a register of who are our artisans? Who are our master weavers, for example? The knowledge sharing governance, not just between institutions, but also between the institutions and the respective knowledge holders. What kind of consent do we get them to sign on to agree, for example? What kind of consent on our part as workers in the heritage institutions need to observe so that we really respect the cultural sensitivities of these knowledge holders? What are the protocols? The cultural protocols of addressing or approaching someone who has this knowledge is something that is not being recorded as part of our work process. This is something I would like to highlight and to call upon our heritage institutions to make sure in our ISO 9000 documentation or our work processes, we have to have this. That contributes to knowledge. Again, I want to reiterate this. When we identify how much of participation from our people are we in? Do we have like a, okay, for this kind of knowledge, here's the registrar, here are the master knowledge holder that we have to work with, for example. Do we have that? And how much are we really working with our communities? I'm doing a generalization here. I'm sure it's been done, but are we really working very hard on it? This is the indigenous knowledge ecosystem, which I think the heritage institutions have to think of while managing that indigenous knowledge, they also have to manage their own corporate organizational knowledge so that whoever comes in and when there are changes of staff who's doing it, there is a continuity on observing this. So the whole ecosystem here is you have to have a network of knowledge holders to know who. You have to know who they are, where they are, what are the specialties, for example. The spiritual dimension of knowing what and knowing why. Of course, the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of the know what. The knowledge receivers, just now I mentioned, the knowledge contents, the dimensions. This whole ecosystem, Prof, is another rich avenue for the school or the faculty to do further research. My recommendations for my studies from a knowledge management spectrum. When you do indigenous knowledge and organizational knowledge, you have to look into these three aspects of it. It's three spectrum. The asset management part of it, the processes relating to managing the knowledge assets, the process-based, the codification and improvement of your practices, and of course, the developmental part of our human capital who are doing this. At both ends, the organization itself, the heritage institution, and also our knowledge holders at the indigenous community. The other part is, again, at the knowledge management angle, we look at collaborative. Definitely, it is a must, and we have to do this. The collaborative knowledge management practices that can be adapted by cultural heritage institutions, collaborative safeguarding of indigenous knowledge. When we say this, one institution cannot be alone. It has got to be collaborating between institutions, but also between other peer or like bodies as well. The collaborative network of knowledge experts about safeguarding indigenous knowledge. Our experts can be our own people. Our experts also can be shared with other people globally who are also people who have an indigenous community amongst them. And this collaborative knowledge organization and storage. Knowledge organization and storage, sometimes we think about buildings. And I would like to call it, for the Sarawak knowledge here, we have a diaspora of people who keep knowledge about Sarawak and its people globally, not just in Sarawak. Then the collaborative indigenous knowledge accessibility. When we acquire that indigenous knowledge, how much can we share? How much cannot be shared? And if it cannot be shared, how do we go about with it? It's just like in records management, there's an embargo on certain records. Likewise, in indigenous knowledge, there's certain embargo because of certain spiritual requirements. Whether we like it or not, it's there. Then, of course, the collaborative sharing of organizational knowledge. Heritage institutions have to work together amongst them so that we do not repeat. Sometimes I got this. They said, so many people came to me and they're asking me the same thing, but they're different from different organizations. Sometimes they say, what else do you want? Who are you? Where are you from? Now, who else wanting this? And it's the same thing. Why can't we talk amongst the heritage institutions? Why can't we talk? What have you done? Can we expand on this? If you have done this, I'll look into another area. That kind of collaboration. The most important thing, and this is something that is really very close to my heart, is on safeguarding by the protection of our indigenous knowledge intellectual property. This, I give you one example. In my younger days as an officer who was very intrigued with this, Tusau Padan's artwork being used in attires, fashion and all that. What kind of recognition do we give to him as the owner of that design? The tattoos, for example, that we have. Tattoo houses are making a lot of money of it. It's good. It's one way of us for us to kind of share about our tattoos. How different is it from a Maori tattoo, for example, or how different is it from a tattoo from another country? Do you know how to differentiate between tattoos of different indigenous groups? That is something for us that we need to talk about. We need to discuss a lot. Now, how do we look into and look after the intellectual property of our indigenous people? Where should we start? For example, from what I gathered, the conservation methods, the Tagal, if I'm not mistaken, that word. What kind of recognition as an intellectual property do we put onto that method? It is a conservation method for fish. What do we do about it? I'm asking the academia over here, how can we work further on this? So, to end my presentation for you, and I want to have a lot of discussion about this, is no amount of documentation can contain the entirety of the still tacit indigenous people of Sarawak. The noble efforts by our heritage institutions in wanting to safeguard the indigenous knowledge will not come to fruition without the desire and, most importantly, the consent of our indigenous people ourselves. Just, with due respect to our friends from the museum, whoever they are, if they are here, I came across this when I was visiting the museum. And personally, I might be wrong. People might criticize me for this. I find it sad for this image of the poor being cut into pieces like that. To me, and this is my personal opinion, this is not respecting the cultural sensitivities of how a poor should be treated. You can criticize me for that. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. You've given us so much to think about, Rashidah. It was wonderful. While the audience, the live audience can be thinking about questions, we've got a very good question here from Gregory Reed from Swinburne. He's asking, what are your thoughts on balancing both the need for preservation and accuracy and authenticity and creative interpretation? The earlier holds respect for tradition, but may not be as accessible. And the later speaks for the new interests of the younger generation, therefore preserving. Can we both coexist? Commercial and creative reinterpretation, bringing wider audience interest into the original unaltered tradition, thereby preserving culture. Do you get the question, Rashidah?
That's a long question.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a microphone.
So Rashidah is preparing to answer the question. You just need to.
Oh, okay.
Is it?
Test one. Okay, test one. Okay.
I expect something along this line. Now, of course, our first and foremost, this is again, this is my personal take on this one. Balancing the importance of tradition and accuracy. Definitely,
first, our priority is to design. And secondly, we can expand, but please not forget to acknowledge or recognize the source of those what shall we call the traditional cultural expression that you use for your creative reinterpretation. Acknowledge where it comes from, acknowledge the knowledge holders, acknowledge the community source. There's no harm, and I would like to kind of relate to it, that no harm in using it and expand it, but so that our people know, or people outside they know that
Okay, all right.
So there's something easier. Sorry, I have to acknowledge the source. By all means, you can use that for creativity, but at least people outside there know that this is from the people of Sarawak. There's one way of preservation, but also, to me personally, when you use a traditional cultural expression in its original sense, then educate people how it expanded for the creative industry. I hope that answers Greg's questions. There's another interesting question from Faisal Jamal. She's asking, considering that indigenous peoples generally do not have the same notion of intellectual property, that is rights belonging to the community and not the individual, how should IP reflect this? Now, one of my favorite part of intellectual property is on geographical indicators. And again, in my early days of awareness the civil service, I highlighted the main example I gave was champagne from France. The champagne drink from France, you can call almost similar drink like that is growing from another place. So we have been let's see, I remember this when I think the district office and resident office and the importance of intellectual property and the awareness of intellectual property. So it might not be the same as the intellectual property or trademarks or patents or there's another, but we have one which we call the geographical indicator. So that we recognize that the Songket Rajang is different from Songket Kedung, for example, or the Buak from Betul is different from Buak from Happy. Okay? You see, I kind of put it into parallel over here. The one in France, they have different places that produce wine. The champagne is registered as a geographical indicator for the wine. Wine from champagne itself, and you cannot call champagne that currently grown in Australia called champagne. So likewise, so Sarawak has a lot of indigenous roots or indigenous food or indigenous craft that we can go into contact to identify with them. So in the sense that the IP law has already provided for all we need to do is a lot of awareness, and the community need to know, and all of us have to do our role to say that, hey, this is intellectual property of my people. So having that kind of awareness from some kind of classes have got to be done for our students. I hope I answered that.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor, please? Are there any questions? Yes, can somebody pass a mic over?
Better be not.
Yes,
I think I'm quite loud enough to
but we've got people online.
Online.
People online want to make a question. Sorry,
Mr. Dix. Can't really hear all. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much for that very interesting talk you're given to us. And it definitely enlightened my own understanding of indigenous knowledge. And the question I would like the clarification from you is more or less along the line that was asked earlier. And this is regard to bio rice. Everywhere I go in shops in Beijing, I find huge bags that are filled with bio rice. And I know very well that the production capacity from the island
It's very
is not
little.
able to supply all those shops with that kind of quantity.
Yeah.
And they are selling at very premium prices. So what do we do? As we move from bioerosion about this practice,
Okay.
your clarification would enlighten us if there is a way forward.
we need to take the mic.
If I may suggest, Datu, thank you for that question. The barrio community should bring the matter to my IBO and highlight the matter, and then go back to the producer of that rice. I always have that same thinking that I say, wow, because we know the production amount is not even enough, even up to me, and it's so much in the market now. Highlight, because I know barrel rice has been part of one of the geographical indicator under my IBO. So highlight this matter to my IBO, and then we have to kind of put it on the table. So now is the community that claims. You have the right to claim that. Claiming to say that no one else can use the word barrio rice unless it is from barrio. And this matter has got to be made loud and clear. Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes, can we take the mic over to the lady? Can you introduce yourself and say where you're from, please? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lily. I'm from IBS. So I want to ask you regarding for example, if you're studying about subject matter which has a scarce software, scarce software, what would be the first step for you to do in which there are not a lot of information that you can find about it? What are the steps that you would take? And then my second question is that, for example, if the people, if I'm studying about a ritual, if the people who conducted the ritual have already passed away, will the verbal software be reliable, or how will they be? Will there need to be a reenactment or something like that? That's the question.
All right, for the first question just now, when you know that materials are scarce, your first, normally, if you know the source, okay, normally we go to the source community, right? And then, I mean, this is my approach. I encountered the same thing when we had our effort to document matters on Srawakiana when I was at the library. We have to go to the source material, the source community, and speak to the community through the proper protocols. We learn our lesson because we were young and we were a new organization, and we just, we want to do as much as possible, and we just went. But on hindsight, what we should have done was work with organizations like Majlisat Istiadat. Now you have the library, now you have the museum, and also there are NGOs. Go to the NGOs. When I did my research, I went to the NGO first and then asked them. So that kind of protocol, they will be the one who lead, and the kampong people, when they know these people, they're quite open to you. Yeah, that's about scarce resources. Then the other question is when the knowledge holder have passed on, okay, you might have to interview those people closest to him, starting with the family, or the other, he would have somebody who kind of was his student or disciple. These are the people that you go to. We had one instance when we did the recording of the Bolhassan traditional healing. That healing is not being practiced anymore, but the knowledge holder, we were lucky, the knowledge holder was still alive at that point of time. But he has to reenact because it's not practiced for quite some times. So we have to reenact the whole ritual. Yeah. So you really have to do a lot of groundwork, and you have to be patient. I know in this digital world, you're not patient, but with indigenous knowledge, you really have to be patient. Yeah. Good luck.
Any more questions from the floor? If not, we'll just refer to this question again from Gregory B. He's asking, what are your thoughts about a community when a community IP should start and stop? That is, should a community selling a certain type of food be allowable by another community? Who decides whether another community can wear a costume from another community?
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for this interesting question. For the community IP should start and stop. I don't have a real good answer for this because in a world now that we have, I can make panso ayam, but I know very well, or panso manok, cannot panso ayam, panso manok. I know very well that is from my Iban friends, but we always acknowledge that here are the dishes from our Iban community. Acknowledge that the source of the community who started it, or who sort of it's their traditional cultural expressions. I might not be able to give you a good answer to this one. Now, who decides whether another community can wear a costume from another community or not? I think we're seeing that a lot in Sarawak for the fact that we are multi-diverse ethnic groups. I've used Iban costumes, but again, I didn't claim that as to be mine because I know and I have to acknowledge that this is not from my community. I'm a Melanau, but I use an Iban community costume. But most importantly, if there are any culturally sensitive things that you use, that you have to really acknowledge and get the consent of the community. For example, the tattoo. I know the tattoo among some of our indigenous groups are very, very revered. Some tattoo cannot be even used just simply anyhow. That kind of understanding of the cultural protocols must be in us. The other thing is, for example, in one of the the Lukut Skala bead of the Orang Ulu. Not anybody can wear it, and not anybody can own it. Even though you have it, but you're not supposed to own it, you also need to kind of acknowledge. This is what I was being told during the interviews. So to me personally, if you are using another community's attire, with the exception of if it is general, everybody can use it. For example, like Kumangawai kind of ladies, you know, even she's not an Iban, she's in the Kumangawai, for example. But the most important thing is to have to acknowledge it. That's to me is how I can answer your question at the moment. Yeah. All right.
Any questions on the floor? Yes, Donna.
Hello. Hi, Val, I'm online.
Hello. Hi. Thank you, Dr. Rashidah, for the excellent talk. My question is more on the documentation on intangible cultural heritage.
Documentation.
Yes. My question is more on the documentation of intangible cultural heritage. And I noticed that there is a lot of complexity when it comes to documenting intangible cultural heritage due to the, how far it goes back. And that changes the knowledge as well because of the cultural transmission, the changes of generational lifestyles. So when we are doing documentation, is there like a certain way that we can identify and work on it, like, sort of like a window, or if we don't do that, kind of, you never stop researching because the further you go back, things change, and beliefs, practices all change because of all that too.
Yeah.
So I find that a little bit complex when it comes to documenting ICP.
Yes.
What is your opinion with us?
Same as yours. Now, in one of my interviews, I worked with the participants from Majlis Adat Istiadat, and this is on the correct me for the term that I use if it's wrong. For the Babiao and the Sampi, the dirges, when they do the prayers, for example. And I am really thankful to what the initiatives of Majlis Adat Istiadat, and if not for them, quite an amount of this knowledge would have been gone, and they have been religiously documenting it. And one of the gentlemen that I interviewed, he was mentioning to me that the dirges that he compiled was already this thick, because again, he shared again the first level in the tier, the foundation part of it. It was easy. He said everybody seems to know the common macam pantun lah, ya. I just try to make it like as simple as possible. Everybody, so that part he can easily collect from the community, from the Rumah Pandang people. But come to a stage, so they will have to kind of consult with each other. Do you want to go with this? Do you want to continue with this? Do you want to touch on this? Because knowing that a certain part of it is not in their belief now. So the researcher had to, I'm just sharing, the researcher had to get the consent of the community. How far would they want to go? And if they want to stop at one point, you have to respect that. So, and in our writing and the documentation, you have to indicate that based on the feedback you receive, you have to indicate that window. You are right with that window of time that this is been practiced, because we have to respect the cultural sensitivities of the knowledge holders. That is the most important. Yeah. Thank you. I hope that answers.
Thank you. We've got another question in the chat box from Jacqueline Bukitigan in Sabah. And she's asking, are there moves to redesign UNESCO definitions of intangible cultural heritage? The term performing arts is a Western concept. As an ethnomusicologist, I have issues with this because it does not reflect indigenous ideas.
Okay. Now, if you go, Jacqueline, thank you so much for this question. If you go online and you go to the UNESCO convention, there is, and they will tell you what's the latest update. And the latest update I saw when I was working on my study, it was 2016. The latest update I saw was 2022, meaning to say they have been ratification, also of new things. So do email your concern to them because they do have sessions of meetings on this matter. So I'm not able to answer you directly over there, but best contact UNESCO directly on this. Yeah. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Thank you. Because many of us ethnomusicologists have issue with the
Are there
definition.
any last questions? No? Well, can we all give Dr. Rashidah a big round of applause for an excellent presentation? And we will now turn to you. Before we close, it's my privilege to invite Dr. Fitri on stage to present a little